Hi, and welcome to this first video in a series I'll be making for IB Psychology exam tips. Um, in this video, we're going to look at abnormal psychology, the option in paper 2, and the specific topic, etiologies of disorders. This is for the new curriculum, and this is what the topic looks like here. So 10 tips. I think there are a couple of bonus ones as well, but I think these are going to help you prepare smarter for your exam, so you'll be well prepared to write any essay question based on this topic. So first thing to remember is that with paper 2, there are 3 topics in every option. So here we have, this is taken straight from the IB Psychology Guide, and we have the 3 topics for abnormal psychology: diagnosis, etiologies, and treatments. You're going to be asked 3 questions. 1 question is guaranteed to come from each topic. So what that means is you can become an expert in just one topic because you know you're guaranteed 1 question from the etiology of abnormal psychology. You're guaranteed to get a question from that. So that means that if you like, you don't have to study the other 2. Now, I like a 1, 2, 3 approach where you take one. This is I'm going to be a master in this one, and you might have a backup treatment. I think is a good backup, but don't spend too much time on that one. And you have a third where you can just study for interest's sake, but exam prep, I wouldn't worry about it. I think etiology of abnormal psychology is a really good choice to become an expert in and prepare to write your essay on, because look, there are only 2 topics. Here we've got 4, here we've got 4. Now actually there are 3 topics within this, and we'll see why at the end of the video. And actually treatment of disorders also has 3. I'll explain that in another video. So I think in terms of content, these 2 are the same. So there's not much between these, and so actually your choice might depend on which one you are more confident with, which one you feel you understand better. But I think for today we'll focus on etiology of abnormal psychology. I think that will be a popular choice. And remember, you're aiming to write an essay of about 1,000 words. Okay, so that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is etiology and explanations mean the same thing. So it doesn't mean that you have to study different content for this topic as opposed to this topic. All right, etiology just means the root cause of a disease or a disorder. So if you're explaining the root cause of a disorder, then you're giving an explanation. So same thing, no more extra topic. For explanations and also etiologies, we're going to use those terms interchangeably, synonymously from now on. Make sure you've got 1 biological and 1 cognitive and 2 studies for each. Now, what about social cultural, you might ask? Well, we'll get to that later. I'll show you why you don't have to worry about that for explanations just yet. But make sure you got 2 for each. For example, PTSD. The biological explanation I would encourage you, my students to use would be abnormalities in the brain. And for cognition, we look at appraisals. And then making sure we have 2 studies to support each of those. Tip 4, use the explanations as counter-arguments for one another. So in a question where you're asked to give an explanation, you might say, well, it's biological, however, it's also cognitive, or vice versa, right? It's cognitive, it might be biological. Let's say, for example, your question is, discuss 1 etiology of 1 disorder. Well, what you might do is say, well, 1 etiology is brain abnormalities for PTSD. And then you'd give a couple of studies, and then you'd develop a very good argument there. Then you would say, however, in order to have a discussion or to evaluate the etiology, or no, discuss the etiology, you would say, however, we can't ignore the role of cognition. And then that's your counter-argument. And that's going to give you 3 studies for your essay. You're going to have 2 for your central argument, because you've already prepped those for your biological, and you've already prepped the cognition as well, so you can just use 1 there. So you use different explanations as counter-arguments to one another, and that's going to show your deeper understanding of psychology. You know that anything like a psychological disorder is not explained from one approach. We have to consider multiple approaches, and that's exactly what we want you to be able to do in your exams. Now, here's another important tip. 1 approach is 1 etiology or explanation, and this is really important to think about because your questions in the exam might ask you, for example, evaluate 1 explanation for a disorder. Now, if you choose a very specific example, so for example, PTSD, you say, well, 1 explanation is a small hippocampus. You've really limited yourself from what you can write. And let's say you forget some details as you're writing, and then you go, oh man, I don't know what else to write about the hippocampus. You can make that very broad and say 1 explanation or 1 etiology is the biological approach. Now, everything that falls under that umbrella can be used, and that will allow you to write more. In the previous syllabus, this was allowed in paper 2 exams where whole approaches can be used as 1 etiology or 1 explanation. So, for example, if we're saying, discuss 1 etiology of 1 disorder, we would say, well, 1 etiology is from the biological approach or the biological approach. Well, 1 etiology is the sociocultural approach. This will help. I think I'd also say that for PTSD, I think one etiology is appraisal. You've got more than enough for appraisal. I think that's fine. And brain abnormalities, the 3 parts of the brain, hippocampus, amygdala, and PTSD. PFC. Those 3 will give you enough. So I don't think you have to have the whole approach, but you do want to make it so it's clearly identifiable as one, like brain abnormalities. That's a pretty clearly identifiable one etiology, but it allows you to write about multiple examples. That's key when you're preparing. Now, this is probably the best tip I can give you in this video. If you're explaining prevalence rates, you're explaining the disorder. So this is where your social cultural explanation can come from. So really, this is just one topic that looks at biological, cognitive, and social cultural explanations for one disorder. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. For example, you might explain gender differences in prevalence rates. Well, that's not necessarily social cultural. But I think, let's say, for example, you're given the question, discuss prevalence rates of one or more disorders, or discuss prevalence rates and disorders. If you focus on a social or cultural difference, you have to identify differences in prevalence rates. Now, if the group that you focus on has a social group or a cultural group, that's going to, when you explain why they have a difference in prevalence, you're going to be explaining a social cultural origin of the disorder. To give you an example, and the example I use in my textbook and in the revision book is socioeconomic status. Now, a very, very common finding is that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people who have less money, are more likely to develop PTSD after a traumatic event. Now, that's the prevalence difference, so we can explain that rate, right? PTSD is more prevalent in people from lower socioeconomic background than people in a higher socioeconomic background. Now, there's not much to explain this, so I have to be able to say why. A really good answer about prevalence rates will go into a detailed explanation about why. And if I focus on the social differences, or the differences between those groups, then I'm going to give a really valid explanation. And I'm also going to be giving a social cultural explanation. So there's a whole heap of overlap here. And for example, I link this back to appraisals as well, and that socioeconomic status can affect your negative appraisals. So we're linking with the cognitive approach, which shows the interaction. And also socioeconomic status can also influence the development of the hippocampus. So we've got the connection there of the 3 factors. So you've got the social cultural explanation, but it also overlaps with the other explanations. And so we're just finding those overlaps. It's going to give you the chance to write some very good essays here. This, I think, is a very good phrase to remember to use in your exams when you are explaining something that's very, very commonly found. Research has shown ... Now, if you can't think of the state, you don't have to have individual references for your essays because we can't remember every single reference. You should have studies that support the key points you're making. But when you're identifying a common finding in people with a particular disorder, this is a very good phrase to use. And if you're giving an explanation of a disorder, then it has to be you have to state very clearly what is the factor that's linked with the disorder. And so, for example, when we're writing about PTSD, a very important sentence, I think, to have in your answer is, research has shown that, and you could use one or more of the following, are associated with PTSD. So before I explain brain abnormalities, or during my explanation of brain abnormalities and their as an explanation of PTSD, I would say, research has shown that small hippocampus volume, small amygdala volume, and small prefrontal cortex volume are all associated with PTSD. Later, I'm going to give the evidence that supports that. But just for now, I'm going to say research, like I'm clearly identifying that's the factor. Research has shown that negative appraisals can also predict PTSD, and I think that's a very good, it's a very good phrase to have in your answers. Okay, another tip: finding overlaps between the biological approach and PTSD. Paper 1, Paper 2. You can use material from Paper 2 in Paper 1. Neuroplasticity. The example I have, these have to be very specific. So for PTSD, looking at socioeconomic status and the development of the hippocampus, this is an example of neuroplasticity. Localization of function, I've got a study here that looks at the VMPFC and cognitive appraisals, linking the brain and cognition. The study shows that the VMPFC is important in cognitive appraisal. We can use that for localization of function. Technology, now, there's a lot of correlational studies on brain using MRIs and connecting brain growth and development with PTSD. That's using technology, MRI. So I can use that as a technological technique in the biological approach. Similarly, correlational studies. These are the MRI correlational studies. I can use the same studies and just instead of focusing on the technology aspect, I focus on the correlational aspect, and I can use that material in an essay about research methods on the brain and behavior. And same thing with anonymity and ethics. So where possible, when you're preparing, you can find some overlaps between Paper 2 and Paper 1. Right, now, this is kind of going back to my earlier point about research has shown that in your the deeper you go into any psychological disorder, the more you'll realize that everything's interconnected. And with my examples of PTSD, this is exactly what happens. And so what I found is that students can very easily get confused about, wait, but it's biological, but it's also cognitive, but it's also sociocultural. And if you've learned if you've learned the disorder in depth, you'll realize that everything's interconnected, and it can be very confusing where to start. And as a reader of exam answers, it also can be very confusing if you try and show all the complex interactions too early. So I would suggest start very basic in your answers. So, for example, let's say you've got this question: discuss one etiology of one disorder. Now, I'm going to say one etiology is the brain, and then I'm not going to include any studies yet, right? My central argument in my essay, and here somewhere I will link my advice for writing good essays. But I'm going to say why a small hippocampus might be associated with PTSD, right? Because of memory, and could be associated with memory issues. Why the amygdala might be associated with PTSD, because it activates the stress response. That could explain symptoms like arousal. The PFC, because then we can't cognitively appraise, so we can't reduce the stress response. Okay, if you haven't studied PTSD, this won't make any sense, but it's all in the textbook and the revision book. Anyway, I'm going to begin with this. This is very simple stuff, very basic. Why the hippocampus is linked, why the PFC is linked, why the amygdala is linked. No overlap, no interaction just yet. Then I'm going to have a meta-analysis, and I've put a very basic one in the revision book, which you could summarize about 3 or 4 sentences. Very simple. They took 50 studies, and they found all those things: hippocampus, PFC, amygdala, all correlated with PTSD. It's so simple to explain, and I haven't shown any interaction yet because I don't want to confuse my reader. I don't want to confuse myself. The next study is Gilbertson's twin study, focusing on the hippocampus, particularly is linked with PTSD. Now, there's my 2 studies that support my argument, and if I do this right, that's going to be about half of my essay right there, because there's a lot to explain. Now, I'm going to counter, as I said before. I'm going to say, but however, this is to discuss, I have to have a balanced review. So I'm going to say, well, I'm not just going to focus on biology. Appraisal, the cognitive approach is also important. So then I counter with my appraisal can be a factor, and then I'm going to have a study that links that. And in the revision book, I put a very simple one, which is showing that how kids after a car accident negatively appraise the event. There's a correlation. More negative appraisal equals higher chance of developing PTSD, or more symptoms. So again, very basic. So there's no interaction yet. Now, it's only later, and this is where I'm getting into the end of my essay. Now I'm going to start with the interaction. Now I'm going to say, however, and this is my counter argument, my second counter argument, I'm going to say, but we can't look at the brain or cognition individually because they're interrelated, and then I'm going to get into the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and its link with appraisal, and this is going to explain why a low volume or low activity in the VMPFC might be linked with PTSD, because we can't positively appraise, or we can't reappraise anything that activates our stress response, and I've got Uri study is a great one for there. So do the basics first, and explain individual etiologies, and then you look at the complex interactions later on in your essay. And then and my third counter argument here might be evaluations. So again, I'll link to my 3 rules of 3 for writing good essays. Okay, now, if you're going to focus on just one approach, so if you're thinking, I'm going to put all my eggs in this basket, I'm not going to worry about the other 2, this is what I want to write about, then you have to be prepared to write a whole essay on one research method. You might be asked, because you might be asked to write 1,000 words on a very narrow topic, like one explanation or one research method, one ethical consideration. That could be a reality, so you have to be prepared to write 1,000 words on that. What I'd say with one research method is prepare 2. Have 2 studies for one and a second study for another. And a second example. Because if you're going to talk about correlational studies, for example, that's a good one to talk about. And you can say, here are the strengths, and here are the studies, here are the examples of a correlational study. Say, however, it's limited, and then you use a true experiment or an experimental method to highlight the limitations of the correlational method. That's a good way to do it. And that's going to allow you to write more about more studies and to have basically a better essay. One ethical consideration, now use the same studies that you did for the research method. And you're going to find the overlaps there. But again, you have to be prepared to write a whole essay about that. That could be very tricky. And this is why it's good to have a backup. This is why, focusing on just this etiology of abnormal psychology, if you get a question like, discuss one ethical consideration related to research on etiologies, that's a tricky essay. And, you might, if you just study, let's say you just study one treatment, like that, then that could give you a backup. So this is the ethical considerations and the research methods questions, or why you have to be very prepared if you're only going to prepare for one topic. Again, be prepared to write a whole essay on one topic. biocognitive or social cultural explanations, of the disorder. Again, prepare 2 studies per explanation. So you got 2 to support your bio, 2 for cog, 2 for social cult. And if you make sure your social cultural explanation is also related to prevalence rates and disorders, then that's sort of there as well, right? Now, what you've got here is paper 2 and 6 studies. Now, the materials, so the revision book, well, if you're revising and preparing your own materials, you should be able to figure out how you can prepare for any question in paper 2 for abnormal psychology for one of the topics. So if you're standard level, you only have to do one option. You should be able to do this in 6 studies, right? Now that's pretty awesome. Now this is going to be difficult. You're going to have a really good understanding of one of those disorders if you do this. But it does make it easier well, doesn't make it easier. It does make it easier, but again, it's still very difficult, and you have to know those 6 studies very, very well. You also have to know the explanations of the disorders very well as well. So you have, paper 2 and 6 studies if you have those, 2 for bio, 2 for cog, 2 for social cult, and the revision book will show you how that can be done as well. Now, what I would say, one last tip, one of my final tips is choose one study out of those 6 that could be linked to any of these topics, because you might be asked a question to evaluate one study related to etiologies, explanations, or prevalence rates, and that's really tough. That's a very, very tough question. But so I would choose one of them that you can evaluate. Ideally, it's a study that can be used in the core as well. And so what I like is Luby's. Now, this is Luby et al.'s study linking poverty, stress, and parenting with development of the hippocampus. This provides a possible etiology of abnormal psychology, social cultural etiology, and looking at how those external environmental factors can influence the development of the brain. It can also be used for social cultural theory because it shows the triadic reciprocal determinism. Our environment can affect our internal biology, which can affect our cognition. It also gives an explanation for the disorder, that maybe the small hippocampus volume is a factor of our environment. And it can also explain why people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to develop PTSD. So choosing one study, so no matter what the one study related to is, or we might get, say, evaluate one or more studies, or evaluate research related to. If you've got this study, you can describe it in about 150 words, really good detail. You can explain 2 or 3 limitations of it, maybe 1 or 2 strengths. Then you're going to be very well prepared to answer this, what would otherwise be a very difficult question. Now, this is a difficult question because you want to use at least 2 or 3 studies in your answer. So I would make sure you've got a second study to use to evaluate whichever one you're going to choose to become an expert on. Now, I didn't prepare this ahead of time. I should have. What's a good study I could use to evaluate Luby et al.'s? Well, it depends on whatever explanation you're giving. So, I mean, really, so if I was saying that Luby et al.'s provides a socio-cultural explanation for PTSD, then I would just have a second study that highlights, but it's also biological, and then now I'm thinking Gilbertson's shows that genetics can be a factor that explains the difference in hippocampal volume. So I would use that study, then I can describe it and use that to evaluate the first. Okay. A bonus point now, when writing about essays, to what extent evaluate, discuss pretty much all mean the same thing. They can all be answered the same way. You've got a central argument, right? Then you've got your evidence, and then you've got counter arguments. To what extent does one of these approaches explain a disorder? Well, you say, well, it could be biological, but then you counter argue. To discuss, you have to have the central argument, but then to have a balanced review, you have to counter argue. If you're going to evaluate the research, we say, well, here's the research, here's what it shows, here's the topic it's related to, but here's the limitation. If you're going to discuss, I mean, they're the same thing. You do need to be ready to contrast. What I would do is make sure you can contrast explanations for disorders, so biological and cognitive. And ideally, if you're aiming for a 6 or a 7, go beyond just the superficial. Yeah, that one said it's biology, but this one said it's cognitive. That's pretty superficial. Maybe look at contrasting the supporting evidence. Maybe looking, contrasting how many variables are connected in the relationship. Contrasting the research methods used in the studies that support the explanations. Looking, is it internal factors primarily? Is it external factors? Is it just one internal, just one external? Yeah. So be ready to contrast for the essay. Here, I'm just going to put up a bunch of practice questions. I won't read through these, but if you're a student preparing, now these are just how I think the questions could be worded. There's a little bit of uncertainty, so I'm not going to say that these are how they're going to be phrased. If you're a teacher wanting to write a a mock exam or a practice test, then feel free to use these or adapt these. But if I was an exam setter, this is the types of questions I would ask. Again, preparing for your exams, if you're a student, you might want to put these in a hat, draw them out at random, and then give yourself 5-10 minutes just to try and plan and see how well you could answer that question. And then also, actually, what you want to try and do with that is look at how you could answer multiple questions using multiple different questions using the same types of studies. All right. So they're my tips for the etiologies of abnormal psychology. I hope they're helpful. If it's not helpful, leave a comment. Let me know. I make these videos to help other students. I'm making this video for my own students because they have a test this Friday. Good luck, guys, on this exam on this material. So I wanted to make that. Apologies if I'm a little stuffed up. I'm actually working from home today because I have a cold. But anyway, links to more information is in the link here for the video. Ask questions, leave comments if there's any particular topic you want help with, anything at all. We've got heaps of information on the blog. We've got Facebook groups for students that have been asking great questions, and then links to other resources as well. All right, so good luck with your exams. I really hope that was helpful, and good luck.